Before I begin, I would like to provide some background information so my experiences make more sense. These are my true experiences living in a haunted house and are all 100% real. Unfortunately, I do not have any pictures or video of these occurrences. I always wanted to put up cameras inside our home to see if we could catch anything, but my mother was too terrified to ever do it. I moved into this house when I was about 11 years old, and for a few years I didn't witness anything paranormal happen. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but a few years after we moved in, my brother passed away unexpectedly in our basement. After this, the weird, unexplained occurrences started happening. In the stories I'm going to tell, it is mostly from my perspective, but my mother has shared accounts with me as well. Now to get on with it. Shortly after his death, small things would happen like bottles falling from the table on their own, cabinets being opened, cold spots, and footsteps. My brother was a prankster and loved specifically scaring my mother and I. I had other family members living in the home with us, but my mother and I were the only ones that ever experienced anything. We often wonder if it is because my brother was specifically targeting us to spook us, or if we had some kind of sixth sense. I couldn't explain the feeling I would get being in that house. Even if I was alone, I always felt like I was being watched. Sometimes I would go home alone and have such a strong feeling of this that I would immediately leave and stay somewhere else because it was so overwhelming. I've never felt anything similar in any other home. My mother felt the same way, and they ended up moving from this house a few years down the road because she couldn't stand living there anymore. I often heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom, and most nights would be woken up by it. One night I woke up to them, and then after a few minutes felt my mattress sink down at the end as if someone had sat at the foot of my bed. I looked down and no one was there, even though it still felt like someone was sitting there. I shared a room with one of my siblings, and they were sound asleep across the room. I didn't want to say anything to wake them, but was terrified of what could be causing this. I eventually convinced myself it was a figment of my imagination, as I was still half asleep. When I awoke in the morning, the feeling was gone. The room where the death occurred was right across the hall from our laundry room. I loathed laundry day since I felt so uncomfortable being downstairs. It was always eerily quiet in our basement, regardless of who was home making noise upstairs. I typically would hear shuffling and creaking in the basement, which always would make my hair stand up. My eyes always seemed drawn to the door of the room where the death happened, and I'd find myself staring at it for minutes without a reason. As soon as I would close the laundry room door, I would get out of the basement as quickly as possible. Every time I ran up the stairs, I felt like something was chasing me, waiting to pull me back down. The stairway always felt like it was infinite, especially with how dimly lit the basement was, making it hard to decipher any shapes. Oftentimes, I would walk backwards up the stairs, half expecting something to creep around the corner and chase after me. My mother recounts an experience where she came out of her bedroom and saw the figure of my brother walking down our hallway into the kitchen. It looked just like him, but seemed to have a transparent look to him. For some reason, she chased after it and watched it walk through the kitchen and disappear into the basement door. She wanted to continue chasing after it, but was so terrified she could barely move. She also frequently would wake up to the fridge door being wide open or every cabinet door in the kitchen being open. No one else in the family would have done this, so she always blamed it on the ghost. We also had a dog, and after the death in our basement, he refused to go down there, even though prior to that he would go down all the time. It didn't matter who was down there, or if one of his toys fell down the stairs. He would not step foot down there. Most of the time, if the basement door was open or someone went downstairs, he would stand at the top and just stare down. On a couple occasions, we would also catch him barking at a wall or his eyes following something no one else could see. One time I was sitting in our living room while the rest of my family was asleep, and I had been up late playing video games. I had 2 lamps in the living room turned on, and the overhead hallway and kitchen lights were on, as I felt very uncomfortable in that house when the lights were off at night. All of a sudden, every light that was on shut off at the same time. I jumped and stared into the dark hallway as my eyes adjusted, expecting something to be there. With the light on my computer in front of me, it was impossible to make out any shapes in the darkness. I figured we must have lost power or a fuse had blown. I was playing on a laptop, so it would make sense that my computer was still on. I shut out of my game as I in no way intended to be out there in complete darkness, and noticed it was still charging. The charger had been plugged into the same outlet as one of the lamps that was now out. The cable box was still on as well, which was plugged into the same outlet as the other lamp. This meant it wasn't possible we lost power or a fuse had blown. I tried turning the lamps on and flipping the switches for the hallway and kitchen, but nothing worked. After realizing the lights were not coming back on, I shut down my computer and quickly ran to bed, not wanting to find out what would happen next. I later realized the hallway, kitchen, and living room were all on separate fuses anyway, so that theory was impossible as well. When I woke up in the morning, all of the lights worked perfectly fine. I still cannot explain what happened that night. My final experience, and the most terrifying, was when I was 17 and at the house alone with my boyfriend at the time. We were sitting on the couch in the living room and started hearing what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs to the basement. We were both confused what the noise was at first, as it sounded like faint banging, but it was coming from below us and progressively got louder until we could no longer hear ourselves think. Shortly after it started, we could hear what sounded like someone banging on the door to the basement, which was always shut. Something was banging with such force the door was rattling in the frame. We knew no one was home and were so freaked out that we quickly ran out to my car and could still vaguely hear the banging outside. When I went home that night, the noise had stopped and no one in my family mentioned any weird things happening, which makes me believe it must have stopped shortly after I left. I moved out a few months after this as it was becoming impossible for me to sleep at night and I was constantly afraid. My boyfriend at the time denied the possibility of it being a ghost as he does not believe in the paranormal, but I still find it impossible to be anything else. Once after this, I heard the footsteps again running up and down the stairs, but it was more muffled that time. Several times we heard knocking, and I often wonder if it was my brother knocking on the basement door trying to get our attention. Another sibling still lives in this house and is adamant he has never experienced anything paranormal. Since moving out, I still have yet to step foot back in that house. The memories of what happened are still hard to handle, let alone the unexplained experiences I had the years following his death.